Chapter 21 World War One.
Good morning. Today is June 24th, 1914. Herzegovina, Bosnia, and its capital city of Sarajevo, which is now under Austro-Hungarian rule. Sitting in the back is Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife.
What they don't know right now is that there are Serbian nationalists waiting for them with bombs and revolvers.
Assassination attempts had failed, only harming other cars and spectators. Ferdinand was making his way to the hospital to visit the wounded in battle, but on his way was Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist, a member of the Black Hand Gang.
Princip would fire two shots, one at Ferdinand's neck and the other one was intended for the Bosnian governor, but instead shot Ferdinand's expecting wife in the stomach, killing the both of them.
The reason the Serbians were so angry was because they believe in self-determinism.
What's self-determinism?
Self-determinism is the belief, spread during the French Revolution and Napoleonic conquests, that people of the same ethnicity, language, and political ideals should form their own sovereign states. The Serbian, like other ethnic groups like the Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, etc., who had lived in Herzegovina, Bosnia, wanted to integrate into the Kingdom of Serbia, not Austria-Hungary.
No wonder they targeted the heir to the throne. Jeez.
Right, and then Austria-Hungary was infuriated by the assassination, accusing the Serbian government of planning it.
Then they asked the Serbian government for reparations, but they found that a clause would disrupt their sovereignty because the Austro-Hungarian government had asked to be involved in the investigation behind the assassination on Serbian lands.
Consequently, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia.
After war was declared, countries went to take sides. Germany backed Austria-Hungary, while Russia backed Serbia.
In the years leading up to World War I, fierce national rivalries were heating up across Europe. Germany's rapid industrial growth began to rival Britain's long-standing economic dominance.
Once the world's industrial leader, Britain saw its output drop while Germany flourished. The British did not take well to that. Then, both nations attempted to build a better navy than the other. When Germany started constructing a fleet of battleships, Britain bought in dreadnoughts, which was run by steam turbines.
This would cause a naval arms race, and during this, the European powers were also trying to add new colonies. African territory was being fought over like a toy, as well as control in other countries like Siam, Persia, and Afghanistan. Germany had the most beef with Britain and France, though, so this would eventually contribute to their alliances in the Great War.
In 1905, the French and the German were fighting in control for Morocco. The Germans pinned for Morocco independence to win over their favor. In return, the French threatened war.
Contributing to European tensions, the Balkan Wars also took place. There would be two consecutive wars for the possession of the European territories held by the Ottoman Empire. This would tatter the relationships between European nations and set up the Great War. The people look angry.
Yeah, mostly because they want to see their country flourish over the others. They wanted to win all those colonies.
News! News! Read all about it!
Ooh, they are super heated in the news.
Great example of nationalism, calling for action to better their country.
Europe was like a ticking time bomb, while national rivalries and rising nationalism built a ton of alliance.
And these alliances were definitely meant to keep peace, but really they backfired because it only straightened the path to war.
One alliance, the Triple Alliance, was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, while the other was the Triple Entente, which was France, Russia, and Britain.
Each country had their own war plans. France with Plan 17 would always have an attack.
While Germany had the Schlieffen Plan, which would target France first and then Russia, there would be no more room for sweet talk.
As news of war had spread, most were hit with shock and fear.
But namely, mostly city dwellers praised the war effort, calling it glorious, a good adventure for their soldiers.
The soldiers left, with pride, hoping to make it home soon.
But the war didn't end. It went into trenches, mud, and millions dead.
A total war that even asked civilians to help with the war effort, like women, workers, and colonies.
It began. On July 29th, 1914, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia made a choice that would shake the world.
Under pressure, he mobilized Russian troops, not just against Austria-Hungary, but also against Germany. His advisors said that if he didn't It would ruin important plans that could risk defeat.
The Germans sent an ultimatum to Russia, telling them to cease their troops' mobilization against the Austrians, one also to France hoping to know their intentions.
The Russians basically said a blunt no, and France had no comment, which prompted Germany to declare war on Russia, and France began to make their move. Then 2 days later, Germany declared war on France as well. The Germans wanted to attack the French on the left flank, through Belgium, so they invaded Belgium. But since Belgium was a neutral country, they were backed by the British government. The Germans didn't stop. The British declared war on them.
A lot of people thought the war was going to be short. In early August 1914, 20 million young men took rifles and left to war. The idea behind war was that it was heroic, glorious, and honorable. The Germans had made their way towards Paris in August 1914, but was stopped by the French and British armies along River Marne. Both sides tried to outflank each other, which took them to the North Sea.
The battlefront was called the Western Front, that went from Switzerland all the way to the North Sea. They would fight for a long time, each side hoping to wear the other out.
This continued for 3 years. In the south, Italy left the Triple Alliance and joined the Allies in 1915. If they were victorious, they would give Italy Austro-Hungarian controlled territories. World War I brought a deadly stalemate. Defensive tech like barbed wire and machine guns made crossing no man's land almost impossible.
Machine guns shredded advancing troops. Barbed wire trapped them. Old tactics no longer worked.
To hopefully end the battles, both sides tried new weapons. Poison gas like mustard gas was the most feared. Mustard gas blinded, burned, and slowly killed over weeks.
Just craters, corpses, and rats. In the east, the front moved, but the death toll stayed. Russia pushed early, then collapsed under the weight of defeat and bloodshed. Verdun, the Somme. Hundreds of thousands died for just a few miles of mud.
Most bodies were never found, and for the first time, civilians became targets, bombed by the sky, starved by blockades.
Not just armies, but entire societies were at war. Total war meant everyone was involved, on the front lines and at home.
In countries like Britain, Germany, and Austria, the war helped women win the right to vote, aka women's suffrage.
The Ottomans had joined forces with the Central Powers and fought the Allies.
In Gallipoli, the Ottomans successfully fended off the Allied forces and retreated to the fronts, but
since the Ottomans joined forces with the Central Powers, it increased conflicts with Britain, adding on to their previous problems of interest, political tension, and ambition.
The British used many of their armies to construct an attack against the Ottomans. The British also helped the Arabs to revolt against them.
The British won against the Ottomans with the help of the revolt.
Towards the end, Germany played a huge part in suffocating the Allies.
The Germans used submarine warfare in order to strangle Britain economically, and in the process of destruction, Germany also had killed and destroyed U.S. citizens and shipping boats.
The U.S., being angered, declared war on Germany for interfering and causing problems. Germany eventually lost by trying to fight the Allies one last time, but failed.
The U.S. were reinforced with troops, which led to their victory. Germany accepted the armistice on November 11, 1918. The victors made the Treaty of Versailles to make Germany accept the responsibility for causing the war. Germany and Austria-Hungary were not allowed to join political factors after that.
Basically, in the start it was Austria-Hungary who caused it, but they disappeared and the blame went to Germany.
Chapter 24, World War II.
Hello, I'm Brick Shane, and I will be talking about World War II. So, there are two different groups of nations, one being the Axis powers, which consists of Germany, Italy, Japan, and plus any conquered territories. And the other group being the Allied powers, consisting of France, Britain, USSR, China, USA, plus the colonies and the Allies. The cause of war had been the economic hardships of World War I and the Great Depression. Germany, Italy, Japan wanted to undo the Treaty of Versailles because they thought that the terms were unfair to them. The Axis power group started to expand their territories through conquering other lands, and the rest of the world basically let it happen. But after invasions became aggressive, war broke out. Japanese forces took Manchuria from China during 1931 to 1932. They had also left the League of Nations after being condemned for their actions on China. They later had fully invaded China during 1937, where they had began to commit atrocities such as the rape of Nanjing, where during the mass destruction of cities, around 400,000 people were killed, and of those 7,000 women were raped by the Japanese soldiers. In attempts to keep China weak, they had stationed 750,000 soldiers in China, which ended up weakening their military. Hitler rose to power in 1933 and had claimed to fix all of Germany's problems after the loss of World War I. One of his tactics was to blame a scapegoat to accuse of causing all the issues surrounding Germany at the time, such as how he blamed Germany's defeat and loss of power onto the Jewish people. His ways of rebuilding was mainly to fix their military despite it being illegal because they were still under the Treaty of Versailles. They had also began taking other aggressive steps to creating a new Germany under Hitler's rule, such as leaving the League of Nations, bringing back the military draft, and helping the Spanish in the Civil War. Austria had become annexed in 1938. Germany had taken the Sudetenland, claiming to protect the ethnic Germans. Munich Conference was basically France and Britain giving in hopes of avoiding war, but Hitler broke his promises and took the rest of Czechoslovakia. The Nazi-Soviet Pact had been signed in 1939, which had made sure that the Nazis and the Soviet Union wouldn't fight each other. In the pact, they had secretly agreed to divide Eastern Europe. Later on, Germany had invaded Poland in September 1939, which had caused Britain and France to declare war, officially starting World War II.
Ignore how dark it is. The microphone was dead during half of Brookshane's recording, so just ignore that. But Germany had been using a new tactic called Blitzkrieg, in other words, lightning war. This involved fast surprise attacks using newly developed powers and tanks. Germany used this tactic on Poland in 1939 and France just a year after. This resulted in Soviets taking the eastern part of Poland and France surrendering. The Battle of Britain was when Germany had began bombing cities, which had later been called the Blitz, which London was the main target of these bombings. The British resisted against the Blitz, which had resulted in Hitler postponing invasion plans. In 1941, Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in the Operation of Barbarossa, which had consisted of 3.6 million soldiers and resulted in initial success, with Germany leading into Moscow. It got even darker somehow, but ignore that. Soviet resilience consisted of relocating their industry and surviving the harsh winter of Russia, which eventually stopped the German advances. Japan had expanded into Asia, where they had taken French Indochina and began attempting to take over other resource-rich regions, such as regions where oil is commonly found. The U.S. initially imposed their oil embargo and had frozen their assets, which had pushed Japan into planning war and attacking Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. This attack had resulted in the U.S. and Britain declaring war on Japan, along with Germany and Italy. Japan's early victories consisted of rapid expansion throughout Asia, where they took the Philippines, Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, and more. They had justified their actions by using the slogan, Asia for Asians, to promote the independence from Western rule, which in reality meant Japanese dominance. During June 1942, the Battle of the Midway had begun, where the U.S. had ended up sinking 4 Japanese carriers, which forced Japan out the Pacific. The island hopping campaign had intended for the U.S. to get closer to Japan by capturing key islands. Many battles had occurred to gain control over islands such as Okinawa and Iwo Jima. As a way to fight back, Japanese forces sent suicide pilots to target Allied ships. Okay, guess what? There's another lighting change. But the Soviets moved west, and Stalingrad gained victory, with Germans retreating. When Soviets reached Berlin, Hitler committed suicide, officially collapsing the German Nazi Party, which later led to Germany surrendering on May 8, 1945. And now to the Cold War, which, guess what, is also me. Peace out!
Japan had occupied a lot of territory during the war. They had puppet governments in some places, one being in the Philippines, and others were under control by the military. Japan and Germany exploited the people living in the areas they took over, which led to millions being forced into slave labor. Nazi Germany killed 5.7 million Jews and millions of Romani and Slavic people. Early on, Jews were encouraged to immigrate, but most countries wouldn't take them. During 1942, the Wannsee Conference was held, where many high-ranking Nazi officials had began planning mass deportations and exterminations of the European Jews. 5 years later, the Einsatzgruppen had began holding mass shootings to eliminate as many Jews as possible. Later on, the Nazis discovered a new form of mass killings through poisonous gas. They would do this by sending the Jews to concentration camps, to gas, and later cremate. Without all the men left, many of the jobs in the cities were left to the women. This mainly occurred in the US, in the UK, and the USSR. Despite this progression, many of the women were made to return to their traditional roles as wives and mothers. Many women in Asia had experienced a very different life, with many being forced into prostitution, with Southeast Asian women being the main targets. These comfort women were often raped to 30 times a day, which left many dead or wounded. Despite being the victims of this war crime, many of these women had been outcast and shamed by society.
Chapter 24, The Cold War.
Although the US and USSR were alliances in World War II, they broke their alliances, but they never directly fought each other. During 1944, the Yalta Conference was held, where the Allies had agreed on free elections in Eastern Europe, but Stalin had ignored all these efforts. The USSR wanted to have full control over all of Eastern Europe, so it could act as a buffer for any future invasions. This action was taken as an aggressive act to further spread communism. The United Nations was a group created to promote peace and prevent any further wars. The Security Council consisted of 5 permanent members, which were the US, USSR, Britain, and France. The Marshall Plan was when the US had agreed to donate $13 billion to Western Europe to help rebuild. The reason for that generous act was to strengthen economies and to stop any communist influence from spreading further. The USSR rejected this, and in return, they created Comecon, which was a Soviet aid program for Eastern Europe. The Truman Doctrine was when the US had promised to help any nation in their efforts against communism. This originally applied to Greece and Turkey, but it later spread. This was the official start of the containment policy and efforts to stop the spread of communism. NATO was established in 1949 and acted as the US and Western Allies' defense. The Warsaw Pact was established a year later as the Soviet Union's response to NATO. Post-war, Germany and Berlin had been split amongst the US, USSR, Britain, and France. With these zones, the Western powers had merged their land to attempt to rebuild Western Germany. In response, the USSR had created the Berlin Blockade, which cut off all access to West Berlin, keeping many needed resources away from anyone stationed in these zones. To combat this, the US and Britain had launched the Berlin Airlift to supply the city for close to a year.
There were 2 separate ideologies found in the Cold War, with the US being very anti-communist, while the USSR had a very communist view and had made sure there was a strict adherence to those views. Both sides utilized censorship and propaganda to control public opinion, which had an even stronger influence on society at the time, with television having an even stronger influence on people than ever before. During 1949, China had its communist revolution after Mao Zedong and his communist followers won their civil war. This caused any nationalists to leave China and flee to Taiwan. Post-Cold War, China and the USSR became close allies because of their shared communist views and fears of the US and any of its influences. Because of their close alliance, the USSR began providing military and economic aid to China. After World War II, Korea had split into 2 sides, North and South, with the North being Soviet-backed and the South being US-backed. Both sides pushed against each other, but neither backed down. As a result, over 3 million had died, which had later sparked a US containment policy in Asia with the formation of CEDAW. This had introduced the domino theory, which meant that if one communist country fails, the surrounding countries will too. China had begun to grow more and more upset with the USSR, with the reason being that they received no help with nuclear weapons and they received little to no support with their war against India. China had officially split with the USSR at 1964. In 1949, the US and the USSR had begun testing atomic bombs and other weapons, but they had built up their arsenals to the point of MDS, or in other words, mutually assured destruction. This had led to a balanced terror to prevent direct war. During 1959, Fidel Castro took over Cuba while being politically aligned with the USSR. The Bay of Pigs was a failed US-backed invasion of Cuba during 1961. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had started off with the USSR planting nukes in Cuba, and in reaction, the US had begun creating military blockades in an attempt to prevent the launching of any missiles. This crisis had later ended with the USSR backing down in exchange for a US promise. During 1953, the Soviet leader at the time, Khrushchev, had begun a de-Stalinization plan, which had intended to loosen the control the government had on the people, along with promoting a peaceful coexistence with the West. The USSR had later used the Brezhnev Doctrine to ensure the rights to invade socialist countries if threatened. Detente was a period where the US and the USSR had eased tensions by reducing hostility and having arms talk, which stopped the use of nuclear weapons from both sides. US President Nixon visited China and the USSR in 1972 in order to signal cooperation between these nations. And that is the end of the Cold War. Peace out!